The salt fields stretched endlessly under the pale Josian sun, a shimmering expanse of white bordering the restless sea. Li Guillaume, his peasant garb stained with grime and sweat, walked with a deceptive slowness, his eyes sharp and intelligent, constantly scanning his surroundings. He was no mere farmer, but a Guanchalsa, a young military officer tasked with a clandestine mission to investigate the rampant salt smuggling that plagued this coastal village, a festering wound on the kingdom's prosperity. The rumors pointed to Choi Dae-gam, the local magistrate, a man whose opulent lifestyle starkly contrasted the villagers' destitution. Guillaume's arrival had been carefully orchestrated. He'd feigned injury, collapsing near the grand gates of Choi Dae-gam's estate, a sprawling complex that loomed over the humble huts of the salt workers. He played the part of a simpleton, his movements clumsy, his speech hesitant, a mask to conceal his true purpose. He'd overheard whispers, seen the furtive glances, the fear in the eyes of the villagers when Choi's name was mentioned. The magistrate was a leech, fattening himself on the lifeblood of the people, trading precious salt, a vital commodity, with foreign merchants for personal gain. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, Guillaume was summoned to the inner courtyard. He'd been assigned menial tasks, hauling sacks of salt, cleaning the stables, enduring the scornful looks of the household servants. The summons came from Hong Buin, Choi Dae-gam's wife. He found her in a secluded pavilion, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and something else, something intoxicating and dangerous. "You," she said, her voice like silk, a stark contrast to the coarse fabric of her hanbok. She was breathtaking, her beauty a cruel joke in this den of corruption. Her eyes, dark and luminous, held a hint of sadness, a flicker of rebellion against the gilded cage she inhabited. "You are new here. What is your name?" "Guillaume Buin," he replied, bowing low, feigning humility. "I am but a humble servant." "Humble?" She laughed, a melodic sound that sent a shiver down his spine. "You have the eyes of a hawk, Guillaume, not the dull gaze of a farmhand." He met her gaze, a calculated risk. The hawk sees much, Buin, but it also knows when to keep its beak shut. A flicker of interest, perhaps even amusement, crossed her face. "And what has this hawk seen in Choi Dae-gam's household?" "Enough to know that not all that glitters is gold, Buin." He paused, testing the waters. "And that some treasures are hidden in the most unexpected places." Hong Buin stepped closer, the scent of her perfume enveloping him. "Perhaps," she whispered, her breath warm on his cheek, "we have more in common than you think, Guillaume. Perhaps we both seek something more." He knew then that she was not merely a bored, neglected wife. She was a player in this game, a pawn, perhaps, but one with her own desires, her own ambitions. And he, the disguised officer, was now caught in her web. The first thread of their dangerous dance had been spun. The night was young, and the air was thick with unspoken promises, with the scent of salt and seduction. His mission had just become infinitely more complicated. He could feel the pull of her, the dangerous allure of a woman trapped in a gilded cage, a woman who might be his key to unlocking Choi Dae-gam's secrets or his downfall. The following days were a carefully choreographed dance of deception. Guillaume continued his charade as a simple servant, performing his menial tasks, observing everything, and reporting his findings discreetly to Meiwo, a gisang at the local tavern. Meiwo, with her sharp wit and even sharper eyes, was his contact, his lifeline in this web of corruption. Her beauty was a weapon, her charm a tool, and she wielded them both with a skill that rivaled any court official. She gathered whispers like precious pearls, weaving them into a tapestry of information that painted a damning picture of Choi Dae-gam's illicit activities. Meanwhile, his encounters with Hong Buin became more frequent, more charged. They met in the moonlit gardens, under the watchful gaze of the ancient gnarled trees. Their conversations were a veiled game of cat and mouse, a mixture of flirtation and veiled threats. She tested him, probing his defenses, trying to discern his true intentions. He, in turn, played along, feeding her carefully chosen morsels of information, just enough to keep her intrigued, to keep her close. One evening, she led him to a hidden room within the estate, a chamber filled with silks and jewels, a testament to Choi's ill-gotten wealth. The air was heavy with the scent of incense and something else, a subtle, musky aroma that made his senses reel. "Do you like what you see, Guillaume?" she asked, her voice a husky whisper. She was dressed in a sheer geoghery, the lamplight casting a golden glow on her skin. He met her gaze, his control slipping. "It is impressive, Buen." She moved closer, her hand brushing against his arm. "Choi Daegam has many treasures," she said, her voice low and suggestive. "But some are more valuable than others." He knew what she was offering, what she was asking. He was playing a dangerous game, walking a tightrope between duty and desire. One wrong step, and he would fall, but he couldn't deny the pull, the raw, animal magnetism that crackled between them. He was a man, after all, not a saint. And she was a temptation that even the most devout monk would find hard to resist. He reached out, his fingers tracing the delicate curve of her jaw. "And what is the most valuable treasure?" Buen. Her eyes locked with his, a silent challenge, a silent invitation. She leaned in, her lips a breath away from his. "You," she whispered. Their kiss was a collision of fire and ice, a desperate, hungry joining of two souls caught in a web of deceit and desire. It was a betrayal, a transgression, a sin. But in that moment, under the flickering lamplight, surrounded by the spoils of corruption, it felt like the only truth. He pulled her closer, his hands roaming her body, feeling the curve of her waist, the swell of her hips. She responded in kind, her touch both tentative and demanding. Clothes were shed, inhibitions discarded, and they fell onto the silken cushions, lost in a whirlwind of passion. The world outside, with its duties and dangers, ceased to exist. There was only the heat, the sweat, the desperate need for release. This forbidden pleasure, stolen in the heart of the enemy's lair, was a dangerous gamble, a sin that could cost them everything. But in that moment, it was worth the risk. The line between his mission and his desires had blurred, and he was drowning in the intoxicating depths of her embrace. The aftermath was a tangled mess of guilt and lingering desire. Guillaume knew he had crossed a line, compromised his mission, perhaps even his soul. But he couldn't deny the connection he felt with Hong Buen, a connection that went beyond mere physical attraction. She was trapped, just as he was, albeit in a different kind of prison. He saw a glimmer of vulnerability beneath her seductive facade, a yearning for something more than the gilded cage she inhabited. He continued to gather information, piecing together the details of Choi Daegam's salt smuggling operation. He learned of secret shipments, hidden compartments in fishing boats, and a network of corrupt officials who looked the other way. Maywol, with her network of informants, provided crucial details, confirming his suspicions and revealing the extent of Choi's reach. Meanwhile, his relationship with Hong Buen deepened. Their clandestine meetings continued, fueled by a dangerous mix of passion and shared secrets. She confided in him, revealing her unhappiness, her resentment towards her husband, her longing for a life of freedom and genuine affection. He, in turn, found himself drawn to her strength, her resilience, her willingness to defy the constraints of her world. One night, under the cloak of darkness, Hong Buen led Guillaume to the magistrate's private study. "Choi keeps his records here," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "The proof you need is hidden within these walls." He searched the room, his hands carefully sifting through scrolls and ledgers. He found it, a detailed account of the illegal salt trade, with names, dates, and quantities. A damning indictment of Choi Daegam and his accomplices. It was the evidence he needed, the final piece of the puzzle. But as he reached for the document, a noise from the hallway startled them. Choi Daegam's voice, sharp and suspicious, echoed through the house. "Who's there?" Hong Buen's eyes widened in panic. "Hide!" she hissed, pushing him towards a hidden alcove behind a tapestry. Guillaume slipped into the narrow space, his heart pounding in his chest. He heard Choi enter the study, his heavy footsteps approaching. He could smell the magistrate's stale tobacco and cheap perfume. "What are you doing here, woman?" Choi demanded, his voice laced with suspicion. I couldn't sleep," Hong Buen stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "I came to find a book." Choi grunted, unconvinced. He paced the room, his eyes scanning every corner. Guillaume held his breath, praying that the tapestry would conceal him. He knew that if he were discovered, it would mean death, not only for him, but also for Hong Buen. The tension was a physical presence, a suffocating weight in the small space. He could hear the blood rushing in his ears, the frantic beat of his own heart. He was a hunter trapped in his own trap, a spy on the verge of exposure. His mission, his life, everything, hung in the balance. The thin fabric of the tapestry was all that separated him from the wrath of a corrupt and powerful man. Choi's pacing continued for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he seemed to relent, his suspicion momentarily allayed. "Go back to bed," he grumbled. "And don't let me catch you wandering around at night again." Guillaume heard Hong Buin murmur a submissive reply, followed by the sound of her retreating footsteps. Choi lingered for a moment longer. Then, with a final grunt, he left the study. Guillaume waited, his muscles cramped, his breath held tight in his chest. Only when he was certain that Choi was gone did he emerge from the alcove, his body trembling with relief and adrenaline. He found Hong Buin waiting for him outside, her face pale with fear. "That was close," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Too close." He nodded, his mind racing. He had the evidence, but he needed to get it to Maywall, to his superiors. He couldn't risk staying in Choi's household any longer. "I have to leave," he said, his voice firm despite the turmoil within him. "Tonight." Hong Bu, In's eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else, something that looked like despair. "What about me?" He hesitated. He knew he should leave her to her fate, that she was part of the corruption he was sworn to fight. But he couldn't. He had grown to care for her, to see beyond her flaws, to recognize the spark of goodness that still flickered within her. "Come with me," he said, the words surprising even himself. She stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Leave? But where would we go?" "Anywhere," he said. "Anywhere but here." He knew it was reckless, dangerous, a betrayal of his duty. But he couldn't leave her behind. He wouldn't. He met with Maywall, delivering the incriminating documents. The Jizeng, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction, promised to get them to the proper authorities. "You have done well, Guillaume," she said. Choi Dae, Gam's reign of terror, is about to end. Under the cover of pre-dawn darkness, Guillaume and Hong Buin fled Choi Dae, Gam's estate. They rode on horseback, heading towards the coast, towards an uncertain future. He knew that Choi would pursue them, that he would unleash his wrath upon them. But for the first time in a long time, Guillaume felt a sense of hope, a flicker of possibility. He had broken the rules, betrayed his mission in a way. But he had also found something unexpected, something precious. He had found love in the heart of corruption, a fragile flower blooming in the barren wasteland of deceit. As they rode, the first rays of dawn painted the sky with hues of pink and gold. Hong Buin, her face pale but resolute, turned to him. "Where are we going, Guillaume?" He looked at her, his heart filled with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. "I don't know," he said, a wry smile touching his lips. "But we'll face it together." The climax was approaching. Choi's men would be searching for them. The authorities would be closing in on the magistrate. The storm was gathering, and they were riding straight into its heart. But for now, for this fleeting moment, they were free. They were together. And that was all that mattered. The salt fields stretched behind them, a silent witness to their flight, a reminder of the corruption they were leaving behind. The open road lay ahead, a path fraught with danger, but also with the promise of a new beginning. The pursuit was swift and brutal. Choi Dae-gam, enraged by the betrayal and the theft of his incriminating documents, unleashed his men upon the countryside. They were like wolves, hungry for blood, scouring the villages, questioning the locals, their threats and bribes leaving a trail of fear and silence. Guillaume and Hong Buin, meanwhile, rode hard, pushing their horses to their limits. They avoided the main roads, sticking to hidden paths and trails, relying on Guillaume's knowledge of the terrain and the kindness of a few sympathetic villagers who dared to offer them shelter and food. But they knew they couldn't run forever. Choi's reach was long, his resources vast. The confrontation came at a deserted fishing village, a cluster of dilapidated huts clinging to the rocky coastline. They had hoped to find a boat, to escape by sea, but Choi's men had anticipated them. As they arrived, they were surrounded, trapped between the sea and the magistrate's forces. Choi Dae-gam, his face contorted with fury, rode at the head of his men. "You thought you could escape me?" he roared, his voice echoing across the deserted beach. "You thought you could steal from me and betray me? Guillaume dismounted, drawing his sword. He knew this was a fight he couldn't win, but he wouldn't surrender. He would protect Hong Buin, even if it meant sacrificing his own life. "Your reign of terror is over, Choi," Guillaume declared, his voice ringing with defiance. "Your crimes have been exposed. Justice will be served." Choi laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "Justice? You speak of justice? I am the justice in this land." He signaled to his men, and they charged, their swords flashing in the afternoon sun. Guillaume fought with the skill and ferocity of a trained warrior, his blade a blur of motion. He parried, thrust, and dodged, cutting down several of Choi's men. But they were too many. He was slowly being overwhelmed. Hong Buin, armed with a small dagger she had concealed in her sleeve, fought alongside him. She was no warrior, but she was fierce, driven by a desperate courage. She managed to wound one of the attackers, but she was quickly disarmed and thrown to the ground. Choi Daegam watched the fight with a cruel smile. He saw Guillaume weakening, his movements becoming slower, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He saw his opportunity. He spurred his horse forward, his sword raised, ready to deliver the final blow. But just as Choi's blade was about to fall, a shout rang out. "Hold, in the name of the king!" A detachment of royal soldiers, led by Maywol, appeared on the ridge overlooking the beach. They had arrived just in time. The documents Guillaume had entrusted to Maywol had reached the capital, and the king had ordered Choi's immediate arrest. Choi's men, seeing the royal soldiers, hesitated, their attack faltering. Choi himself, his face paling with shock and disbelief, lowered his sword. He was caught, his power broken. The soldiers surrounded Choi and his men, disarming them and placing them under arrest. Maywol, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and triumph, approached Guillaume and Hong Buin. "You did it," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "You brought down Choi Daegam." Guillaume, leaning heavily on his sword, his body bruised and battered, nodded weakly. He looked at Hong Buin, who was being helped to her feet by one of the soldiers. She met his gaze, her eyes filled with gratitude and something more, something that looked like love. Choi Daegam, his face a mask of rage and despair, was dragged before Guillaume. "You may have won this battle," he spat, his voice filled with venom, "but you will never be free. You will always be looking over your shoulder, knowing that I will have my revenge." Guillaume looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and contempt. "Your threats are empty, Choi," he said. "Your time is over." As Choi Daegam was led away, Guillaume and Hong Buin were left standing on the beach, the setting sun casting a golden glow on their faces. They had survived. They had won. But the future remained uncertain. They had defied the law, broken the rules, and their actions would have consequences. But for now, for this one brief moment, they were together. They were free. And that was enough. The salty wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of the sea, a scent of freedom and new beginnings. The waves crashed against the shore, a constant rhythm, a reminder of the ever-changing nature of life. They had faced the storm, and they had emerged, battered but unbroken. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but they would face it together.